Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. I'm here again with Dave McCaughan. He is the founder and storyteller of BIBLIOSEXUal. And if you are really curious as to where that name comes from, I encourage you to go back and listen to episode 1 or maybe episode 2. And we get into where that name comes from. But Dave, thanks again for coming back and doing this cleanup episode.
Thanks very much for having me back. It's great.
Yes. So
it's always good when somebody wants to talk to me some more. You know, that's a nice change, you know.
I know. Could you
come over here and go next door and talk to my wife, because she just tells me to shut up all the time. So, you know.
Well, you know, and that's why we're here. I'm not going to say we're hired by your wife. I'm not going to say we aren't. But, you know, we're here to distract you and take you away from what you should have been doing. And we're going to clean things up. We covered a lot of topics, okay?
Yeah.
So from a high level, you know, you've been in Asia for a very long time, right? And worked with a lot of brands like Coca-Cola and MasterCard, Nestle, Cathay Pacific, all of these things. You've lived in different areas, you know, Hong Kong and, you know, in Bangkok, Thailand. We already, you know, covered that. We talked a lot about the different brands that you've worked with. We've talked about, you know, everything from toilets to Japan and consumers and the youth and silver technology, or the silver cohort of consumers. And we're going to kind of come back, and I just wanted to dive into so many things because I just felt like we left so much meat on the bone here. So There was a lot of things that we wanted to talk to you about. And so forgive us, folks. We're going to bounce around. I'm going to try to give you context, and I'll do my best to catch you up. If this is the only episode of the 3 that we have with Dave, I will do my best, okay? My promise to you. But no promises other than that promise. So I will probably break it. So I want to go back and first of all talk about, because I don't know if we leaned in on this enough, but I want to talk about Coca-Cola. So first of all, where were you in the world? What were the years? How long were you with Coca-Cola?
Oh, so I was working for McCann, the ad agency that handled Coke. First in Australia, I spent 9 years in Australia, and Coke was our biggest client down there. Then I moved to Asia, and the main reason I moved to Asia was actually to work on Coca-Cola in a region that involves Southeast Asia and West Asia. So Southeast Asia and India, basically, right? And their headquarters for that region was here in Bangkok. So that's why I first ended up here. In typical, as you probably know, Todd, when you get sent by a big Western company to go somewhere like Asia, they say, just go there just for 2 years, and then it stays on and on and on, right? So I did Coca-Cola for Southeast Asia and India for about 5 or 6 years. I then, for various reasons, transferred to Hong Kong, but the main reason for doing that was us being assigned to handle the Coca-Cola business for Greater China, so Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the mainland, PRC, and particularly PRC, where this was new ground for our agency and Coca-Cola trying to do something, moving on to the next stage. And so that was really big. Spent 4 years doing that, doing some pretty interesting work in terms of advertising. I think I mentioned in the earlier sessions that, you know, we were the first Western brand to ever do a commercial specifically for Chinese New Year. And so that was a big breakthrough. To this day, they still use the characters that we developed for that campaign back in 2002 as the main sort of celebratory characters. But we also did, and this was really significant, we made a Coca-Cola commercial in China that without going into the whole storyline, what was significant about it was that it was a boy meets girl sort of thing, and crowded underground train platform. You know Shanghai really well. You know that massively crowded underground, and the point is that they sort of proclaim their love to each other on the platform, and they kiss. And this was the first kiss ever on Chinese television. And so you can imagine we had to go through all sorts of legalese and censorship things and it was just literally like that. It was nothing, no tongue, nothing like that. It was just a peck, but just to get the peck in. So we did that. And then after that, I moved to Japan, And there I worked on Coca-Cola in Japan for about another 7 years. So, a long time, 25 years altogether across different countries.
I need to sidebar on this question, just about, and I think a lot of brand owners that might be listening would want to maybe key in on this as well. So the KISS.
Yeah.
And what you went through to get that approved for distribution. Did you know you needed to do this? Did you get it done ahead of time, or was it, rather ask for forgiveness instead of permission?
We knew this would be a big deal. We knew this would be. From the first time that we sat in our office and somebody threw up this draft, this rough idea for a script, which had to culminate. From a Western point of view, we would take it for granted. And there were two Westerners in the team, myself and a Canadian who was the creative director, and we just knew straight, no, it's got to end in a kiss. But then first reaction in the room from all our colleagues was, oh, shit, well, we've never seen a kiss on a screen, right? It just doesn't happen, right? And that led directly to, as when we first presented the idea to the client, we had to say, we had to present to the client and then say to them, look, and we're going to have to do this, this, and this, right? Because this is going to be a big deal. And this is one of those things that, and the clients, by the way, the main client was a Hong Kong guy from Hong Kong, but, had worked in the mainland for a long time, etc. The core of the clients group were mainland PRC Chinese. But, you've got a big American company, a Coca-Cola, an icon global company. And, of course, at some point, this has to go back to Atlanta as well, that this is going to be the number one. This is going to be a number one commercial for the new season. They've got to have it exposed. Now, again, you can imagine if, in some ways, if you were presenting this idea back to a head office back in North America, literally as a script, everybody would go, looks a bit like the 1950s, right? And what's the big deal? And you go, no, but you've got to understand, this is a big deal. And the fact that we had to get special permission from the censorship board, I can't remember the right title, but the censorship board for television, and tell them that at the first presentation made it a big deal and made everybody aware of the fact that, well, we're risk takers here. It's not a risk taker by North American standards, Western standards at all. But in the marketplace, and this is one of those things that when you're working internationally and working in Asia, sometimes you've got to realize that what you're doing in the market, whether it's in China or in India or here in Thailand or whatever, what you're doing here may seem a little old-fashioned, or it may seem been there, done that, but it's the first time ever in this marketplace. And what I think one of the things that many business people, particularly in the marketing world, they tend to get exposed to global standard. Right. And so we're always looking, in the marketing advertising world, you're always looking at things like the Cannes Award festivals and the reels and going, oh, that's great. We've got to do that. And you've got to remember, no, what's breakthrough for the market you're in, right? What's really different for the market you're in? And how risky is that? Or how innovative is that? Or will people actually, there are things that we take for granted maybe as Westerners that are normal practice that in other cultures are very extreme. And by the way, vice versa, right? As we record this, yesterday was the World Cup final. And I don't know if you watched or followed it yourself, but at the end where the Emir of Qatar put that special little cloak thing on Messi, right? The controversy about that in the last 20 there's been more controversy about that than the game. Right? And about what is that? And when you actually know and understand that actually it's just an extreme privilege, right, within that culture for somebody to be asked to wear that thing, right, it's very different from maybe some of the other interpretations that are floating around because people want to take a black and white and attitude to cultural things, right?
Yeah, I mean, anything that was going to happen that was even infinitesimally unique was going to be blown right out of proportion, regardless, because of the microscope that entire event is under. So that was the thing. That was the thing. Yeah. I want to ask about the demographics. I wanted to ask, so you're doing the Kiss ad in China. Do you take into consideration? I've been all over China. And I've seen all the different tier 1 to tier 6 types of areas of the country. Are you taking those into consideration? And more to the point, I even wanted to get to like all your time in Japan. And for those who missed it, go back, listen to that. Lengthy conversations talking about Japan. Like, how different are consumers in Tokyo versus other parts of the country? But then expand that to the other countries that you've lived in where they've had this disparate demographics.
Sure. Well, look, where you guys are, right? Look at the difference between Manitoba and Toronto, right? Or, outback Kansas or the middle of Kansas and New York, right? I mean, there's obviously, and the culture debates that go on in North America, to non-Americans, to non-North Americans are insane, right? Because outside of the Americas, we all look at what's going on there and sort of go, the differences are infinitesimal, right? But when you get into a place like China, obviously, as you know from all your experience, you have the huge differences between the tier 1 cities, the famously tier 1 cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, etc., right? And then the tier 2, tier 3 cities, right? Now, the tier 2 cities have caught up a lot in the last 15 years and are a lot more sophisticated and a lot more exposed to global things than they were. And so if you walk into what is now still called a tier 2 city, I know you lived in Dalian for a while, right? So, you walk into the center of Dalian today and you're going to see Uniqlo stores, right, from Japan. You're going to see, all those sorts of things going on. But, of course, there is a big difference. And then once you go out into the countryside, there's a huge difference, right, because it is literally very different in terms of expectation, the way people live day to day, as we were talking about off air, simple things like the way in which buildings are heated, the availability of services, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in a China, that's still pretty extreme. You can go to other places in Asia where it's going to be even more extreme. And so, Indonesia, for example, the difference between what you can do, what you can access, the attitudes that go on in Jakarta, and then way out in, villages in Borneo, for example, it can be very, very different. But, of course, what you've got to take on board, too, is what's happened in my 25 years of living in Asia, right? When I first moved to Asia in the mid-90s, yes, of course, the internet was starting to get everywhere, but accessing the internet outside of the big cities was often extremely difficult, right? There wasn't Wi-Fi. It didn't exist. Your phone could not do this sort of stuff. And of course, what we've now, of course, seen is, since 2008, the smartphones have sort of penetrated a lot more places. Wi-Fi's penetrated a lot more places. So now you can go to a village, and you're going to find, a kid sitting on the front step of his hut in the village, and he's sitting there playing games online with somebody who he doesn't know where they are. They could be anywhere in the world, right? So there has been that shift, but there are still big differences. Look, you mentioned Japan, right? All you got to do is look at the difference between Tokyo and Osaka. The two biggest cities. Osaka, by any standards, a massive city on the world stage. It's, in Japan, it's little Osaka. It's only 15 million people. It's
the little brother.
It's the little brother. But in the same way that we famously have the sort of New York, LA sort of like rivalry and that sort of stuff, well, then you have that in Japan. And you have a very different heritage. You have a very different. The slang is different. The accent is different. The attitude to each other is different. The attitude to things like drinking, food, changes dramatically. What are acceptable habits between two big cities in the one very, very modernized country? Multiply that.
Really, go ahead.
Do they? Yeah. Do brands care about that and play? Some brands more than others. It depends again on your category, on what you're doing, right? So, of course, the simple term is that well, everybody all over the country wants to modernize and get what the latest thing is. That's probably true, but then it depends on what you're talking about, especially food, beverages, those sorts of things. Then you have to sometimes be a little bit careful about, well, who's going to really want that, right? Who's going to want to feel that it's for them? One of the most interesting campaigns of the last 20 years, not just in Asia, but globally, has been the way that the Nestle company turned Kit Kat around, Kit Kat chocolate bars in Japan. Well. Yeah, and one of the things that they did really uniquely was they developed lots of different flavors. Okay, so you could have, there's the regular Kit Kat and the coffee flavored Kit Kat and the strawberry flavored Kit Kat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things they did, I think going back about 15 years or more, was for each region of Japan, there would be a different flavor. Kit Kat only sold in that region. Now, they became collector's items. So if you have the full range of all of these regional flavors in their pristine packs, it's a bit like collecting baseball cards or anything else. It becomes a collector's item. But what it was also doing was playing up to local pride. Now, people that didn't even like Kit Kat, that didn't even eat chocolate, would buy these things because it was our local thing, right? Our local flavor. And it really highlighted the fact that while there's universal aspiration, globally, and then there's aspiration to have what is seen as American, whether or not Americans would recognize it as such, or there's aspiration to have what is seen as French sophistication, whether or not a Parisian would think it was sophisticated.
Yeah.
But there's also aspiration to what's happening in the capital, right? What's happening in Tokyo or Beijing or Shanghai or Bangkok. But there's also then local aspiration, like identification. And the funny thing is, of course, that in a world where we in some ways, because of media, think the world is homogenizing, and we often hear this thing about the world homogenizing, but we forget that in that homogenizing process, there's also been a real inclination and desire for localization, but we're different. And you notice that everywhere, right? People are from, people from Vancouver, well, we're not like Toronto. We're totally different from Toronto, right? I'm going down to Sydney, at the end of the week to spend Christmas, New Year down there. I've got to tell you, in Australia, Sydney and Melbourne, we hate each other's guts.
Oh, yeah, Beijing, Shanghai, New York, LA.
Shanghai, right, everywhere, right? Yeah. But think about it too. It's that thing about, no, I'm from, I'm from the country. So there is a role that brands have to play to sort of figure out what is the layering of this and how much do you go local? And of course, it's expensive to go local. It's expensive, right? So
it is.
You've got to figure out how far down you need to go to get to a plateau where people are happy with it, right?
Okay. I want to bounce over a bit to talking about Southeast Asia. If you're doing China, you could just do China. You can you can spend all the money and the resources and time and have the whole department just do ads for China or Japan, something like that. Those are pretty self-contained environments. But when it comes to Southeast Asia, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, because now we're talking Philippines and Thailand and Vietnam and some very sizable, obviously Indonesia, one of the biggest in the world, gets lumped in that as well. Talk to us about maybe some of the differences in those regions, are brands ever trying to go into them as a whole? Do you need to talk them off of that and say you can't, or you shouldn't, or you can, but this is what you need to do different? Talk to us a little bit about that.
For big American brands, sorry, I shouldn't just say that. For big Western brands, one of the traps in Southeast Asia, you're correct. Look, China is not ethnically homogenous, right? Despite what the Chinese government
47 dialects.
47 dialects. But of course, we know that basically the Han Chinese dominates the demography, dominates the discussion and everything. Yeah. And yes, it's very sad for some of the other ethnicities, etc. But the truth is that generally in China, you just use Han Chinese as your talent. You appeal to the Han Chinese, and that basically covers off most of the market, right? Southeast Asia is really complicated because, as you say, there's 10 countries in Southeast Asia. There's a number of ethnicities. There's a number of, within countries, there's ethnicities. Malaysia is always a great example because there is the Malay ethnicity, but there is a large minority of Indian Malays who are third, fourth, fifth, sixth generations since their ancestors migrated or first forced migration from India. You've got the Chinese Malay, which again is a large minority, which again quite often is 5, 6, 7 generations since their ancestors came from somewhere in southern China. And so even within that marketplace, you've got to look at the balance, and you've got to think about, look, are we really just going after the Malays, or are we going after Malaysia as a whole, right? Now you have to a certain extent everywhere across Southeast Asia, because you have, for example, Chinese minorities everywhere. Some quite small but very rich minorities that may be not loved by the great majority of people, right? So you've got to be careful about those. The other thing is that quite often, and I know I got trapped into the debate on this for a couple of big clients where, well, we're going to do a Southeast Asia campaign. Yeah, okay. What does that mean? Oh, sorry, no. You mean you want to make a single film, right, or video or whatever, or series of videos for the whole region? No, that's going to be really difficult. Why is that? Who is going to be in it? Are you going to have Malays, Filipinos, Thais, Indonesians? And guess what? People from those countries can spot the difference very quickly and very easily. And of course, you do get circumstances. If I switch on my television here, there will be advertising that I can tell it's Filipinos and it's being dubbed into Thai, right? And there's some things that's fine for. Very, very functional things, it can sometimes be fine for. Very, very sometimes, I would say pseudoscience, like medical type products and stuff, that sometimes could be fine for. But anything that's about lifestyle, about personal ambition, about if you're marketing to people on the basis that you understand what they're about, you can't have foreigners, right? And the foreigner might be the person that's from that border, right? We're not talking about putting a German in it. We're talking about somebody, but that border represents, no, that's different. That's not us. So they are very distinctly different countries. We have, the very Muslim countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, for example. We have very strong Buddhist countries like here in Thailand. We have a place like Vietnam, which is very different again. We have, a very, very traditionally Catholic country, religious country like the Philippines. So you have those very big ethnic differences, religious differences, historically cultural differences. Remember, some are coming from a French colonial base, some Indonesia from a different colonial base. Then you've got the British colonial bases. Then you've got the fact that Thais love to brag that they've never been conquered by anybody, right? Now, let's not get into historical realities, but that's the nature of the different countries, and you've just got to understand those real differences.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Plus, of course, the other thing is Southeast Asia. You've got to remember economically very, very different development. Singapore sits right in the middle of Southeast Asia, but it's not really part of. It's a world of its own. It's literally one of the most developed, sophisticated cities in the world. You can't compare it. It's unfair to compare it with other places, right? Because it just doesn't work that way.
I want to ask about trying to do comedy as an underlying theme. Have you broached that? How well does that go? Is it hard? Is it easier? Yeah. How do you go with if you're going to try to do something that's got some tongue in cheek, some fun, some comedy? How is it to do that in that part of the world?
It's really hard if you're a dumb Aussie or a dumb Canadian, right? And because the truth about comedy, right, is the universal truth about comedy is that it's always about making fun of other people. Every joke, no matter what it is actually about making fun of people, right? But how far you can go and how you do it, right, are very cultural based. Simple example, right? So I know it's totally politically incorrect now, but, I grew up in a world where growing up in Australia, my father was Irish, but the thing was everybody told Irish jokes, right? Now, today, maybe you can't, right? In America, I know there were some parts of America where it was Polish jokes, for example, or whatever, right? And there was culturally throughout history, right? This is why the last maybe 10, 20 years are a total anomaly to human history, because throughout history, people have always told jokes about another country, another cultural group, right? Mm-hmm. And they do that across Asia. Now, some of those don't make sense to us, right? As foreigners, as Westerners, we go, well, why do you think they're funny? I don't get it, right? But there's that. But then there's the sense of day-to-day things, the nuances, right? Think about a lot of the jokes, a lot of humor that you see in, for example, in advertising in North America, is a lot of the humor is based on people understanding some cultural nuance that's going on, right? Because this star did this, or because there's a string of movies about this, or whatever. So you have to understand those. But the biggest issue, of course, is language. If you think about great stand-up comedians that you would know in the West, right, you know that the really good stand-up comedians, it's all about the language and the timing of the way they tell it, right? And the way that they can take little snippets of language, little things out of the slang of the land, and then the timing that's involved in it. And different comics are good at that. Well, even people that I know that have learnt the languages of the countries they lived in still can't get that timing sometimes, right? So humor is a really, really vital means of communication. But the thing is, you have to, as a foreign company, you have to let your local partners really take the lead in that. And you have to have the trust, because quite often, and this is where I've had the issue of some ads or some ideas that got howls of laughter in the room in Kuala Lumpur. But when it was presented to somebody in New York, they just sat dumbfounded, like, I don't get it, right? Because the translation doesn't work. You just can't get it. And that's where you've got to start to understand and trust your local partners, that if they think it's really funny, then it's really funny. If I don't get the joke, it's just because I'm a dumb foreigner, right? Yeah.
Let me ask you something else about the big shopping festivals, right? Singles Day and 6/18, 12/12, and obviously Chinese New Year is a big one. Are those permeating like a Black Friday might into a lot of other places? Yeah. Are those starting to permeate into Southeast Asia? Does Southeast Asia have their own, and what are they? And are you kind of segmenting, build, deploy to meet those types of events?
Yeah, they are. I mean, Black Friday is a good example, right? I mean, the insanity of Black Friday sales going in some, very, very highly urbanized, right? So these sorts of things are really about the big cities, right? It's not about the smaller towns and the smaller cities. It's the big cities and the shopping malls. And for those of you that are listening to this that don't know Southeast Asia, the big cities here are dominated by the big shopping malls, big shopping malls, and that's the center of attraction. Now, those big shopping malls are the center of attraction for people for two main reasons. First of all, they have 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, air conditioning, right? It's a cool place to go because it's cool, as in temperature. And we often forget about that. And the big shopping mall developers understand that there's a large proportion of people who are in those malls not to shop at all, but just to stay cool, right? But to hang out. But the other side of it is that those shopping malls are also magnets for what's happening in the world. It's the visual essence of, if I want to be a modern person, then I go to a shopping mall to understand what is modern life, right? And in doing that, what we've seen then is the penetration of things like Black Friday, or as you say, like 11/11, right? Coming from China, etc. So
yeah,
these things are there. Quite often, though, what's interesting is when you say to people like Black Friday, from a North American perspective, you sort of understand, well, that's the day after, that's after Halloween, blah, 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 blah. Now, Halloween has sort of been penetrating more and more in the big cities in Southeast Asia as well.
That's good.
But Black Friday, in some ways, is bigger than Halloween. So it's not necessarily connected, right? It's just, it's Black Friday. Yes, let's go. It's big sales, right? 11/11 is the thing from China driven by an increased awareness of what Chinese culture is all about. Now, again, one of the things that you have to understand when you're marketing in this part of the world is the way in which cultural soft power works in penetrating a market, right? So soft power is where a country uses its cultural facilities to make an impact purposely, right? So, for example, Korea is probably the most famous example in the last 25, 30 years. The Korean government and the big chaebols in Korea sat down in the early 90s and said, look, Japan did a fantastic job in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of becoming a powerful source of brands by showing powerful cultural factors like Japan pop, like the manga and anime, right, that penetrated the culture across Southeast Asia. What the Koreans did was they purposely did this. They set out by telling the chaebols that owned the TV stations, that owned the music production facilities in Korea, go and sell your product in all these Asian countries to make Korean stuff popular so that then our brands could come in and do that. Now, what's happening in recent years is, for example, is more and more Chinese tourists have been pouring in, or pre-COVID, been pouring into Southeast Asia. But at the same time, what we started to see is the penetration of some more Chinese brands, some more Chinese cultural factors, and things like 11/11, which even other, for example, online retailers have taken up because people have sort of heard of this. And there's a sort of like, if it's really hot in China, what's that about? So you get a reinterpretation in local markets that really isn't driven by the same things as China. It's just, well, this thing is coming from China and China's pretty hot. So, it must be pretty cool. So you're always looking for those sorts of things. And those big sale days quite often are part of establishing that we're part of the modern world. I mean, it may not seem that if you're a cynical older Aussie like me, but that's the way in which people see this. It's like it's something to look forward to. It's a big event. It's a reason to go online. It's a reason to go to the mall and see what's happening again, right? And people are driven by these events, right? They love to have something like that to look forward to.
Yeah. It's the reason they save their money for the month leading up to it, so they can spend more on the day.
Spend more on the day.
So I wanted to jump into the last kind of custodial topic of this episode that I wanted to clean up, something I wanted to get to, and that was talking about AI. So does AI impact the way you're doing marketing now? Does the arrival of tools like the chat GPT, do you think, is that impacting what you do? Do you think AI is going to completely disrupt the world of marketing, or is it just going to be an extra tool in the toolbox? What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it is starting to. I mean, the chat GPT is sort of interesting because you can't open anything on screen in the last few weeks without people, I chuck this in there to see what's happening, right? So, yeah. But I noticed that primarily as an English-speaking world thing at the moment, right? So I'm not seeing a lot of discussion yet where people are talking about, well, I did this in Thai or I did this in Japanese and let's see how that happens. But I'm sure it will, right? There's a fascination with AI. I've got to tell you, I was the co-founder of a cooperative of market researchers across. We called it AI.agency simply because if we say AI, people lean forward, right? As soon as you go into a meeting, you say, I want to talk to you about AI. Oh, what's that? Well, what is it? What have you got? Right?
Kind of like BIBLIOSEXUAL.
Yeah, kind of like BIBLIOSEXUAL. It's the marketing game, right? You got to know what people want, right? What people want, they want the belief that AI is going to be the answer to all problems. Now, the truth is that AI is not the answer to all problems yet. That there are some AI, or more correctly, some machine learning facilities that are helping to solve some problems, right? Or are making things easier. And I guess it's a bit like, and in a crude example, and again, Todd, I have no idea if you're old enough to remember life before spreadsheets.
Life before spreadsheets.
Before Excel and spreadsheets, right?
Oh, no.
So we're looking now at the, say, early 80s. Now, I'm old enough to remember getting to the workforce in the early 80s. And when Excel was first introduced, a bunch of people scratched their head and said, it'll never take off, right? But a bunch of people sort of said, oh, yeah. Why? Because it was a easier way to manipulate data, right? And to get automated answers. That's what it was, right? So if I plug in all this stuff, I can shuffle it around in different ways and then see what the number is that comes out at the bottom of the page, right? So it did what we've been doing for thousands of years, well, at least since the 1100s with, balance sheets, right, which were invented then, and thousands of years of basic accounting was suddenly made a lot easier. Now, what we're finding with AI tools are the things that make stuff that we've taken hours to do a lot simpler, it's being effective. Is it projecting things that are terribly different? So one of the assumptions is if we had an all-knowing, all-encompassing AI platform, then we wouldn't have to do anything. It would do everything. But that's not the platforms we have at the moment. And one of my own experience of working with different AI-driven platforms is you have to remember that having a totally sentient being, right, doesn't really exist yet. What we have is platforms that can do certain things, right, that can do certain things. Now, whether, Elon Musk and other people are projecting we will have real AI next year or 10 years from now or whatever, who knows? But it is making a difference. In certain areas, it's speeding up. It's allowing us to aggregate massive amounts of information. There's an AI platform that I use for market research, for example. And what it does is quite simple. Let's say I want to find out what the world thinks of Todd Embley. I pump in your name into that platform. I say, look at everything on the internet right, that has ever mentioned your name, and it downloads, it reads everything, it analyzes all of that content, aggregates it, and tells me what are emotions are generated by Todd Embley, right? Now, I haven't done that, so don't get worried. But if you think about it, if you're entering a marketplace and you want to know, in Thailand, what's the marketplace think about X? Now, I can go off and do tons of research. I can do focus groups and surveys, and I can read all the documents I can find. This thing, literally, in an hour or two, will look at and read every single piece of content on the internet in Thai that mentions that subject and tell you what are the emotions generated by it. What's the core narrative around it, right?
Yeah.
So it's a big time saver, if you like.
Yeah. I think that's what we need is sentiment analysis for dating. Wake up every day and we get a little score on the sentiment of our partner towards us that day. A little forewarning sometimes, something to work towards.
That may be the next step. That we'll try that next year. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Dave, thank you so much for coming back. We've never had a triple episode with anybody. In 3 years and 160 episodes, we've never done a triple. So I really appreciate you coming back. We have, we got two parts of an episode out of the first long conversation that we had. There was just so much more to talk about and so many more things that I was inspired to talk about. So here we go. We got you, got you back a week later and having another conversation. I hope everybody appreciated that we kind of came back and tied up some loose ends on this one. But Dave, thanks very much for coming back on again, and wish you and yours, happy holidays, Merry Christmas. And, we hope for better things in 2023.
Same to you, Todd. Merry Christmas. Thanks for having me again.
Awesome. Okay. As usual, for everybody who's watching us on YouTube out there, don't forget that we have the podcast. It's on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, everywhere that you get your podcast. It's out there. And for those of you listening to us on the audio only versions, don't forget that we do have the video version over at the WPIC and Negotiation YouTube channels. So from all of us at the Negotiation and WPIC Marketing and Technologies, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.